We have made it to one of the most exciting points of a debate round, the cross-examination. This is the moment at which opponents directly interact, where there is a clash, not between speeches, but live, where one opponent is asking the other team questions, where there's that direct interaction. This is that exciting climactic point that you probably imagined when you think of debate, the opponents directly interacting and engaging with each other. So let's hop on in and let me give you the best tips for how to execute cross-examination. You'll see about half of my general principles are centered around stylistic concerns, what the procedures actually look like, how to compose yourself, and how it operates. And the other half are going to be about strategy, how you think about executing the particular questions within a cross-examination. The important thing within a cross-examination is it's very well defined who is the questioner and who is the responder. Basically, whoever just gave their speech will be answering questions. So if you were the affirmative speaker and you just finished your speech, you will stand up or you will remain standing afterwards, and then an opponent on the negative team will stand up and begin asking you questions. It's not a back and forth in terms of questions. It is one questioner and one responder, which is different than what we would normally have in a conversation with our friends if we were just having a casual debate and there was a back and forth. So let's hop on in. Here are the basic principles. Only one competitor asks questions. There's only one questioner and one responder, as I just noted. Second, this is important when we are doing live debate in person. Obviously, the virtual environment changes this, but still the principle applies. Never face your opponent, always face the judge. When you are having a debate round in person, you'll be standing next to your opponent and you'll be very tempted to want to turn and face the person that you are talking to. This is awkward though, because your goal is not to talk to your opponent or to persuade your opponent. Your goal is to communicate to the audience and to the judge. That's who you're talking to. And so you should be facing them and communicating to them. At first, I promise this will feel very awkward because you are so trained to look at the person that you are talking to. But trust me, for anybody in the audience, it looks way more awkward if you turn to your opponent and you stop looking at the audience or the judge. It makes it look like the debate is getting weirdly personal in a way that will make everybody uncomfortable. For virtual debate, of course, just continue to look straight at the camera. Make sure to maintain eye contact with that camera, and it will look like you're looking at the audience. Third, this is the big one, so make sure to pay attention to this and star this. Never state your own argument as a question. I see this all of the time. Let's say we're having a debate over whether pizza is the best food ever. The affirmative team stands up, gives 3 reasons why pizza is the best food ever, and then the negative team stands up to cross-examination that affirmative speaker. It would be terrible for the negative speaker to stand up and say, hey, so you said pizza is the best food ever, but don't you think that pizza isn't actually that good? Now, why is that a bad idea? Well, obviously, the affirmative team isn't going to say, you know what, I never thought about the fact that pizza might be a terrible food. I completely agree with you. And you're just not going to get any ground. It's just going to be like butting heads, and you're not going to get any strategic value out of that line of questioning. So this is a very important one. Do not just state your own argument as a question. You'll ultimately get nowhere if you do that. So that's really, really big, and I'm going to be holding you accountable for that. Even if you think your argument is really great, just the way a debate round is going to work, it's just not going to end up getting you anywhere. Number 4. This is a big one. Be calm, be composed, be confident. It's really important you don't get flustered and you don't get mean. And so look at the second part here. There are 2 directions you can go, and both of them are not ideal. The first is you become a jerk. And I see this a lot, especially if you feel you're getting the upper hand in a cross-examination. I see speakers a lot do things where, for instance, they'll start smirking or laughing or interrupting a lot. And so you need to absolutely be aware of the optics. If you are shouting, if you are speaking over your opponent, if you're not letting them get out an answer, if you're constantly interrupting them, if you're laughing or smirking, that's going to be making faces when they're responding. All of that's just going to make you look like a jerk, and it's going to undermine your credibility. A lot of the cross-examination at the end of the day is about persuading the judge subliminally that you are the more competent individual in the debate round, that you are more controlled and composed, and that you have more of a handle over what is happening. You actually lose all of your credibility, even over your argumentation, if you end up convincing the judge that you are a jerk. If the judge thinks that you are mean, they will subliminally look for reasons to vote you down. And it's just really uncomfortable for an audience to have to watch someone being mean to somebody else. So don't be a bully. I take that very seriously. Second, the opposite extreme is to be a total pushover in cross-examination, where you just let the other person speak over you. You don't try to defend your own position. You just agree that they are right, and then you just you never stand up for yourself. And so that's also something I see. I'd say with novices, I see the classic progression where I think at first they're so terrified about even responding to questions that they cave immediately. And that's not good. Just stand your ground. Even if you don't think your argument is great, just work as hard as you can to defend it. And on the opposite extreme, once they get a little bit more comfortable, I see novices typically, a little later in the semester by the end of their freshman year. Certainly sophomores really struggle with this. They'll flip over to the opposite extreme where they feel a little more confident, but now they are starting to become jerks. Fifth, have an overall plan of what you hope to achieve in cross-examination. I'm actually going to talk about 5 and 6 simultaneously because I think you'll see what I mean here. And 6 is use the other team's arguments and premises against them. So 5 is thinking through what your ultimate goal is. All right. So if the affirmative team is proposing getting rid of standardized tests, that colleges should not use standardized tests, and you're the negative team and you want to ultimately prove that standardized tests are a really important metric for colleges to be able to fairly evaluate candidates, then you need to have that overall plan of what you want to achieve in that cross-examination. So maybe if you want to show that standardized tests are a good metric of overall student readiness for a university, that they're the closest thing we have to an objective metric, then maybe your overall plan is to have the affirmative team struggle to find any sort of alternative. And so in that particular scenario, what you're going to want to do is to ask a number of questions that will get the affirmative team to admit that other alternatives to standardized tests are not going to be ideal. Now notice, your goal in this cross-examination or the implementation of this strategy is not going to be to stand up and say, don't you think standardized tests are a really important metric to fairly evaluate whether students are ready for college? If you ask that, of course the affirmative team is going to say no. And so that's where number 6 here comes in, which is about using the other team's arguments and premises against them. The goal of a cross-examination actually is not for you to say, I have a great argument. I want the affirmative team or I want the other team to be able to acknowledge how great my argument is, and I will just batter them down like a warship until they finally admit that my argument is superior to theirs. That's not going to work if your strategy in a cross-ex is just to say, hey, other team, don't you think your arguments are wrong? You're not going to get anywhere. They will never concede ground in that particular instance. The goal of a cross-examination or a well-implemented cross-examination does something much more sneaky. It gets the affirmative team or gets the other team to commit to certain premises or claims, and then you show that their own logic ultimately points to a different conclusion than what they wanted to point to. So my first big tip is get the other team to commit to claims. Don't try to ask them, don't you think you're wrong? Instead, ask them to say, well, why are standardized tests so bad? Get them to say something about that. And then you would say, okay, what else would colleges use then to evaluate students if they don't use standardized tests? So notice that these questions are not saying, hey, don't you think you are wrong? Instead, those are more open-ended questions, or yes-no questions can be really good too. Would you agree that blankety blank? Yes or no? And notice your goal there will be to get them to say typically yes, right? And then you can follow up with a why. So you could say something along the lines of, just to make sure I understand, your argument is that standardized tests end up being biased against certain individuals, and thus we shouldn't use them, correct? And the affirmative team will say yes. And you'll say, and so therefore, colleges should be looking at other metrics to evaluate whether students are really ready for college and for fairness for admissions. The other team will say, yes, exactly. And then you can ask them the more open-ended question of, okay, so what other metrics would colleges look at if they didn't have the standardized test? Notice at this point in the cross-examination, you're not springing a trap on them yet. The affirmative team is probably loving it at this point. They're like, this other team is not trying to even debate me. They're just rolling over and letting me say exactly what I want to say. But little do they know a trap is coming. So second, ask why questions. A good line of cross-examination as well that I have put in parentheses here is there's always a tension between if there's a big societal problem, why hasn't anything been done? Or what is the root cause of this serious problem? All right, so another line of questioning is if you get them to admit that standardized tests are very bad, you can say, okay, so what are the issues with standardized tests? They can give you all their problems. It's bias against minorities, it's bias against women, and it's not a good measure of student achievement or student readiness. Okay, if all those things are true, why have colleges continued to use standardized tests to such a significant degree? And then hopefully you're setting up a basic tension in the affirmative team's argument, which is if standardized tests are terrible, why would colleges use them? There's a logical inconsistency there. And that's my third bullet point here, which is finding logical inconsistencies between different arguments. So this is all fairly abstract at this point. I know I've been using the standardized test example. Let me give you another example. So my senior year in high school, the debate topic was about reducing U.S. military presence in foreign countries abroad. My partner and I chose an affirmative where we advocated getting rid of Marines on an island in Japan, Okinawa. The Okinawan island, the people there, the Okinawans, are pacifists. They hate the military. And moreover, the military there has just been causing a lot of problems. In fact, the Japanese public has been protesting to get rid of these troops. These troops have committed multiple crimes, murders. They have sexually assaulted local Okinawans. And no matter how much the U.S. military tries to clamp down on this, there always seems to be just more and more problems. So it's a huge controversy. They're not really doing anything. They've just sort of been there since World War II. And so we were saying, let's get rid of these troops, let's save money, and let's stop antagonizing our Japanese allies. That was the basic story of the affirmative. The negative team's argument almost always was we need to keep those troops there because they serve a really important purpose in deterring our adversaries. So they send a big signal to countries like North Korea and China telling them that they can't do what they want in the region. Otherwise, the United States military is going to show up at their doorstep. And they said, if we withdraw these troops, it will be a sign of weakness that will signal to China and North Korea that they can do whatever they want. So as the affirmative team, after the negative team would go up and make their arguments about deterrence, obviously my overall strategy, what I overall wanted to achieve in that cross-examination was showing that these troops aren't actually important, that this is just all rhetoric, but at the end of the day, they don't actually do anything, and they don't actually deter our adversaries. Of course, if I stood up and just said, hey, you've just made the argument that our troops are really, really important for deterring our adversaries in Asia, don't you think that these troops actually aren't that important? Of course, if I ask that question, the other team is going to say, no, actually, our evidence says that they're really important, and let me explain why. You're just not going to get anywhere. In fact, all it's going to do is give the other team a good opportunity to refute the argument that you're going to want to make in your next speech. That's not great. That's actually just giving them more of an advantage than you an advantage. So instead, what I did is I would go up and I would try to lead them through certain premises. So I'd ask them, my opening question was, your argument is that these troops are, these Marines in Okinawa are really important for deterring our adversaries, right? And they would say yes. And I would say, why? And they would explain when the U.S. military or when the U.S. Marines are there, it ends up sending a clear signal to our adversaries that they cannot do what they want. Instead, they know that the U.S. military is there, and thus they stay in line. And so I'd follow up and say, okay, so as long as the U.S. military is there, and as long as these Marines are sending these important deterrent signals to our adversaries, that means that our adversaries like China and North Korea will stay in line and not do anything aggressive. And they would say yes. And so I'd lead them through a couple of questions like this, just really getting them to commit to certain claims about how important these troops are for deterrence in the region. Then what I would do is I would get to the logical inconsistency. All right, I would get them to commit, I would get them to explain why, and then I would build to the logical inconsistency, which was almost always phrased something like this. I would say, If it's true that these troops are so important to deterrence and that they've been effectively able to deter our adversaries from doing anything provocative or aggressive in the region, then why has North Korea developed and launched over 25 ballistic and nuclear missiles since the 1990s? If it's true that these troops are so important for deterrence, why has China begun sailing warships and military jets, staking claims on islands in the South and East China Sea? All of a sudden, the commitment to the claims that these troops are so important for deterrence has been turned against the negative team in this particular case because of all the historical and empirical examples that prove that their basic fundamental claim is incorrect. The basic inconsistency there was, if these troops are so important for deterrence, then why have our adversaries done things as if they are not being deterred by U.S. military? So that was one good example. Another good example of this was on the topic in 2019-2020, another military topic. Policy debate topics are not typically centered around the military. It just so happened that about 10 years apart they were. And this topic was about whether or not the United States should reduce arms sales to foreign countries. And a popular app on that topic was about reducing arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Basic story here is, Saudi Arabia is not a country that respects human rights, and ultimately they use these weapons that the United States sells them. We sell them more weapons, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars of weapons, more than any other country in the world. We sell the most amount of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is using them to murder people in Yemen, in this war in Yemen. And so the basic story is like, this is a massive humanitarian crisis. Saudi Arabia has shot down school buses full of children. They've used their missiles to shoot hospitals full of injured people. And this is the U.S. military weapons. This is U.S. money on. This is we have responsibility here. And so, okay, what are you going to say is the negative? There doesn't seem to be a great story here. What we would go and do in this instance, our overall plan was to sow doubt about the basic story that Saudi Arabia is just this corrupt government that is only doing evil and nefarious things in the Middle East. And instead, what we wanted to do is set up the basic idea that Saudi Arabia, even if they have some issues, is ultimately an important partner in the war against terror and instability in the Middle East. And so what we would do is we would shift the debate away from what Saudi Arabia has done in the last year or so, and we would try to go back even further. And so we'd ask the basic question of, like these humanitarian crises, you say, are occurring in Yemen, and there's a war going on there. Why did the war in Yemen start in the first place? And the affirmative team would start to answer, and they would inevitably have to talk about these Houthi rebels who overthrew the government violently, which plunged Yemen into a civil war. And then we'd start asking about, well, who are these Yemen rebels? What are they trying to achieve? And the negative team or the affirmative team would almost always try to say, oh, they were just seeking democratic representation. The Yemenese government was really corrupt and oppressive. And that's when we would stop and say, wait a second. Yemen, the Houthi rebels' slogan is death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews. And you're saying that these rebels just want simple democratic representation. And they would say, well, yes. And then we'd ask, in addition, the Houthi rebels are being backed militarily and monetarily by Iran, one of our biggest adversaries in the Middle East. And you're saying still that these Yemen rebels just want democratic representation. And they'd say yes. So you can imagine that cross-examination going on a couple more questions. And the big idea here that we would be able to get to by the end of this cross-examination is sowing significant doubt in the basic story that Saudi Arabia is just this corrupt and evil monster that's just launching missiles and killing innocent people. And instead, we were able to set up the basic idea that, wait a second, these us selling Saudi Arabia weapons is actually very important because they're fighting this dangerous radical terrorist organization that is being backed by one of our biggest adversaries in the region. Once you set up that basic story, the judge and the audience is going to be much more skeptical of what the affirmative has to say. Now notice that the setup there was very different than just me standing up and saying, hey, you have said that Saudi Arabia is killing innocent people, but wouldn't you agree that the people that they're fighting against are radical terrorists? If we had just said that, of course the affirmative team would have said no, and they would have provided an explanation. But instead, in getting them to explain the story of why the war started and taking a bigger bird's eye view on the situation, it forced them into certain premises and conclusions that they couldn't weasel out of, right? Because now we were able to establish that the blame of the civil war was on the rebels. And once we realize that the rebels, their slogan clearly indicates that they're a radical organization and that they're being backed by Iran, I think that definitely sets up pretty significant doubt in a judge's mind about whether or not they are truly just innocent. So I know that those are some lengthy examples. The important thing here is to make sure that you don't just jump into whatever checkmate question you want to get to. Instead, you have to build to it. And the best way to build to it is to get the other team to commit to certain claims or conclusions that they will now be stuck with, and will get them into a problematic stance a little bit later on in the cross-examination. Those are the best cross-examinations. Getting them to commit to claims and then showing there are logical inconsistencies later in the claim. But the key to that is to not reveal your hand too early. You can't just come out and say, well, don't you think you're wrong? Because I promise you, they will not agree that they are wrong. Let's keep going. If your opponent is not answering the question, keep pushing. I see this a lot where the other team just won't really answer the question, and then even though you're asking a great line of questions and you were about to get them into checkmate, your opponent just kind of doesn't really answer the question adequately. And what you need to do there is say, wait a second, my question was, repeat your question, could you please respond to that? And keep pushing a couple of times, and if they ultimately don't respond, you can say, I've now asked you 3 times, I will give you one more chance. Do you have an answer to this question? And make a big deal of it. Don't be a jerk about it, but it's important to be insistent in a cross-examination so that your opponent doesn't just weasel out of a line of questioning, and then you had a great line of questioning that was going to get them to this important concession, and then they just, because they didn't answer it and you didn't know what to do, you just moved on. It's important. Keep pushing, stand your ground without being rude or a jerk, especially if they're trying to weasel their way out of the question. That's a really important tactic in cross-examination. 8, clarify if you're confused. This will happen from time to time. They'll read an argument. You won't really be sure what they were trying to argue there, or maybe in a bigger debate, like in a policy debate round, they'll read a plan and you don't really know what they're advocating or what exactly the plan does. If you're confused, you have to clarify. Obviously, this isn't the ideal use of cross-examination, but it's important in a round. If you don't know what's going on, you're not going to be able to respond to the argument adequately, so make sure to clarify if you're confused. I would say it's an issue if you're having to spend the whole cross-examination clarifying arguments that you probably should have understood. Because there's a difference between you just not having done the adequate amount of research or preparation needed, and thus you have no idea what's going on, versus a team just being outright confusing. If a team's being confusing and everybody in the room is confused about what they just said, then it's important to clarify, and the audience and the judge will love you for clarifying things that are confusing. But if it's just you not understanding basic things, that's not going to be ideal. Nevertheless, if you're confused, you got to clarify. 9, emphasize important points or concessions by repeating the question. All right, so if you get an important concession out after you've followed steps 5 and 6, and you think you've gotten them to a really big checkmate moment, then you want to repeat that. You can say, wait, so you're ultimately saying that even though this issue, even though, opioids are killing hundreds of thousands of Americans every year, more than every war in the 20th century combined, and that there's a really easy way to fix it, that ultimately we just aren't doing anything because nobody in the government has thought about your solution. This would be a cross-examination line if you were getting at that second bullet point on number 6 about if the issue is so serious, why hasn't anything been done? If the other team doesn't have a good answer to that, they're just like, oh, the government hasn't thought about it. Emphasize or repeat that important concession, because even though they haven't conceded that their plan's a bad idea, it's sowing significant doubt in the viability or feasibility of their plan, right? And so it's really important to do that, to slow down, to repeat the question, to make sure the judge and the audience understands it. Otherwise, it's really easy. If it's just a short little blip and you just don't bring it up again, and then you go into your speech and you don't bring it up in your speech, it will be forgotten. Points in cross-examination are only remembered if they are repeated and then brought up again immediately in your speech. So those are my basic principles of cross-examination. I know that right now you probably have a decent sense or some more comfortability with what a cross-examination should probably look like. Now, getting there and executing on it is going to be pretty difficult at first. It's going to take practice, and we will get there over time. But for now, just try to make sure you understand these basic principles and try your best, especially to try what I was talking about in number 5 and 6 here, which is not just springing your argument on your opponent, but instead really trying to guide them step by step through a logical series of questions that get them to commit to certain claims, and then you will reveal that there are logical inconsistencies between those arguments. Hopefully this lecture video was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm excited to see all of you begin implementing your cross-examination skills very soon here.